You might think the Roman Empire disappeared a long time ago, but their ideas, they're still crushing it 2,000 years later. No power tools, no machines, no AI, just smart, lasting solutions that still beat some of our modern stuff today. And odds are, you've actually benefited from Roman hacks without even realizing it. Let's start with the one hiding in plain sight: concrete. Roman structures like the Pantheon are still standing tall after 2 millennia. The Romans weren't just pouring random mixes and hoping for the best. They invented a type of concrete that literally gets stronger with age. Yup, while our concrete today starts cracking and breaking down in a few decades. How? They used a magical combo: volcanic ash, lime, and seawater. That mix created a chemical reaction over time that made their concrete more durable, not less. The stuff practically ages like wine. Like some kind of weird friendship where the longer they're together, the better they get. Meanwhile, most of us just get creaky knees. Hot air flowed underneath and through specially designed wall bricks, warming up the house evenly. It basically turned your whole home into a giant clay oven, except the bread was you, staying perfectly toasty inside. They poured this super concrete into everything: harbors, docks, aqueducts, and delicate temple columns. The Pantheon, by the way, still rocking the largest unreinforced concrete dome in the entire world. A wood-burning furnace sat outside the house, heating air that flowed through raised floors and hollow walls. The temperature was controlled by adjusting the airflow in furnace. The Romans also knew the importance of keeping clean, especially in crowded cities. And their solution? One of the world's first working sewer systems. Some even had basic temperature zones where servants adjusted dampers and vents manually. Furnace operators, basically ancient HVAC techs in tunics in charge of keeping things perfect all day long. Middle-class Romans had heated homes while the rest of the world was still trying not to freeze beside an open flame. That's not just architecture, it's straight-up time travel. And they weren't just left to rot. Maintenance workers actually went inside the sewers to clean and inspect them. Some tunnels were so big a person could walk through standing up. The stones were fitted so precisely, they're still watertight today. They even had a cleaning stick called a tersorium, a sponge on a stick. Shared, yes. Hygienic by modern standards. Not really. But revolutionary for the time, absolutely. Honestly, these were more hygienic than many bathrooms from the 1800s in Europe. Supplying food over thousands of miles without spoiling? That was the challenge. Salt. And here's the wild part. Seawater, which destroys modern concrete, actually makes Roman concrete even stronger. They didn't need computers or measuring devices either. Roman builders were eyeballing stuff that today requires software and simulations. Just raw experience and instinct. For fish, they created garum, a fermented sauce made by layering fish with salt and letting it sit for months. These weren't just toilets, they were meeting spaces. You could literally have a business conversation while doing your business. It kept Rome cleaner, healthier, and way ahead of its time. But they weren't just good at building, they were also experts in comfort. Forget central heating, Romans were getting cozy during winter, with a system that sounds surprisingly modern, the hypocaust. This was underfloor heating before thermostats existed. Their floors were held up by small brick pillars, creating air channels beneath the rooms. Dirty water meant disease, so how'd they fix it? It's like the ancient version of someone who organizes their pantry alphabetically and by color-coded labels. These weren't just clay pots, they were precision preservation systems. A typical mix: 1 part wine to 2 or 3 parts water. Enough alcohol to disinfect, but not enough to party. And some even drank posca, a vinegar wine-water mix that boosted hydration and killed germs. The porous material allowed slow evaporation, but was sealed tight enough to keep bacteria out. So yes, Romans basically created the first real water treatment system using wine. Proof that sometimes the best solution does taste good. Even kids drank watered-down wine with very low alcohol. They also added herbs like mint, honey, or spices, basically creating early cocktails that doubled as medicine. Want something more tangy? They used vinegar pickling everything from onions to eggs. But if you really wanted luxury, you went to the bathhouses. These were the crown jewel of hypocaust engineering. Roman bathhouses weren't just about getting clean, they were community hubs like a wellness spa and social club rolled into one. They had different temperature zones, from cold plunge pools to hot steam rooms. Wealthy Romans even had hypocausts in multiple rooms, effectively creating the first full-house climate control. It's honestly better than some modern dorm rooms, but keeping warm was only part of the equation. The Cloaca Maxima, basically the granddaddy of all sewers, was a massive underground river that carried waste right out of the city, and the public toilets. Oh man, those were next level. Giant stone benches, ventilated buildings, and constantly flowing water underneath to wash waste away immediately. 2 channels of running water made everything work. One underneath for waste, and another in front, with clean water for washing. Rome had over 140 public toilets, all connected to this network. Wealthy homes even had indoor toilets hooked into the main sewer system using a constant flow of water for flushing. They solved sanitation problems that wouldn't be touched again until almost 1,000 years later.
But
Keeping clean ice and tea the same as staying fed, and Romans mastered food preservation long before refrigeration was even a concept. Think about this. Their empire stretched from Britain to Egypt. Their answer? Salt curing wasn't just a technique, it was an art. They had different recipes for different foods, understanding how salt concentration affected taste and shelf life. They were the original meal preppers, except instead of prepping for the week, they were prepping for seasons or even years. Storage was no joke either. Romans used amphorae, giant clay jars holding up to 50 gallons, different shapes for different foods. They had storage jars for wine, oil, grain, you name it. And their secret ingredient for keeping produce fresh? Honey. Turns out honey's natural antibacterial properties were perfect for preserving fruits and even vegetables. They were fermenting before it was trendy. It's the first food hipsters, but with more function than fashion. But while preserving food was key, the biggest daily threat came from something even more basic: drinking water. Roman cities had tons of people and very few filters. They started mixing wine into their water. Not to get drunk, no, this was about staying alive. Diluted wine killed bacteria in the water, making it safe to drink. It was so common that drinking plain water was actually weird. Workers got weaker mixtures. Soldiers had their rations carefully measured. It also made wine last longer, stretching the supply while still making the water safe. But safe drinking water alone wouldn't cut it. Roman cities were growing fast, and they needed a massive, reliable supply of fresh water to keep up. That's where the aqueducts come in. These were monumental, huge stone highways built to carry clean water from distant mountain springs straight into the heart of Roman cities, and the wildest part, they did it all using gravity. No pumps, no electricity, just brilliant engineering and some really, really long slides. These aqueducts had to maintain a very specific, gentle slope, sometimes dropping just a few feet every mile. Too steep, and the water would rush too fast and destroy the channels. That's like building a water slide from the mountains to the city where the slope is so smooth. Water just casually coasts along the whole way. Too flat and it would stop flowing. Finding that sweet spot. It took serious skill. That's enough to circle the earth 10 times. In clay, followed by gravel and crushed stone, and then topped with interlocking paving stones. Meanwhile, modern roads often start crumbling before the paint on the lanes even dries. Each layer served a purpose: drainage, strength, and durability. The result? Roads that lasted centuries. Aqueducts supplied not just homes, but public fountains, baths, toilets, and gardens. Rome alone had 11 major aqueducts, delivering an estimated 300 million gallons of water every single day. It's 50 gallons per person, just gravity-fed luxury. And Groma to survey terrain and make sure everything lined up. This meant military, trade, and communication could all move fast and efficiently. These weren't just good roads, they were battle-tested highways designed to move armies, goods, and culture across an empire. Even the width of Roman roads was standardized for the average wagon. It was the ancient version of lane width regulation. Each station, a fresh horse, and a new rider were ready to go. When one messenger arrived, the next took off immediately. Military dispatches got the fastest horses and most experienced couriers. It was like Amazon Prime. If Prime was powered by horses and riders wearing sandals, riders carried ID documents called diplomas, proving their right to access the service. If someone impersonated a messenger, it's big trouble. Regular government updates moved at a steady pace. Even census data had its own delivery category. In a way, it was the first news network, just without the clickbait headlines. It's like a relay race, but the baton was scrolls and sealed messages. They mapped out long-distance routes that went over valleys, through hills, and even under cities when needed. And they laid the groundwork for legal systems that are still active in countries across Europe, Latin America, and Asia today. A letter could go from Rome to the English Channel in under 40 days, which for the time was light speed. Not random rules or royal whims, but actual, codified principles that made society function. You could draft a contract for a shipment in Gaul and enforce it in Egypt. They distinguished between private and public land, outlined inheritance laws, and even allowed for the transfer of property through written agreements. This kind of legal reliability made international trade possible thousands of years before banks or FedEx. When Roman legions weren't fighting, they were laying stone and digging trenches. Road construction was so organized it operated like a modern military engineering corps. There were checklists, tools, plans, and standardized procedures. Quality control wasn't optional, it was mission critical. You could appeal. They didn't just make rules, they made systems that could last. The Aqua Claudia, for example, stretched over 45 miles, delivering a steady stream of water to Rome. And to pull this off, Roman engineers had to do some serious math. They used tools like the chorobates. Basically, they convinced water to do their bidding, and then designed one of the world's first utilities to deliver it. They had to connect their empire, and they did it with one of the most advanced road networks the world had ever seen. These were public laws written down so that citizens, not just elites, could know and understand their rights. This was the start of the rule of law. No more guessing what the king said yesterday. And unlike modern plumbing, which clogs and leaks and needs repairs, some Roman aqueducts are still in operation today. Their water systems had better uptime than most people's Wi-Fi. But with clean water and good roads, the Romans weren't done yet. Roman roads weren't just roads. They were the foundation of civilization spanning over 250,000 miles across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. These roads were engineered not just dirt paths. They had multiple layers. Starting with a drainage layer of sand, many of those routes are still used today, either as modern highways built directly on top of them, or with actual Roman stone still visible. The layout was just as smart. Major roads radiated outward from Rome like spokes on a wheel, and they thought of everything. Roads had slight curves to help with drainage. They had mile markers to show distances. Drainage ditches on the sides kept water from eroding the foundations. Underneath, some roads had underground drains to handle flooding. And speaking of armies, building roads was part of their job. But roads weren't just for soldiers. They were essential for commerce, governance, and communication. And that brings us to one of the coolest Roman inventions you probably never heard of. The Cursus Publicus, the Roman Express mail service. Yep, the Romans invented fast, long-distance mail delivery. Not for love letters or postcards, but for government business, military strategy, tax updates, and law enforcement. Here's how it worked. They set up relay stations every 10 to 20 miles along all the major roads. This system allowed urgent messages to travel non-stop, day and night. Different messages had different priority levels. To keep things moving, each station had rest houses for official travelers, storage for supplies, and workshops for repairs. And the system was secure, so only authorized officials could use it. Messages were coded or sealed. The scale of this thing was enormous. Thousands of horses, hundreds of outposts, and a dedicated workforce running what was basically the first continental delivery network. These relay stations also acted as information hubs. Local reports were collected and sent up the chain, while orders from Rome traveled down. And all of this worked because Romans had something we still rely on today: laws. Their first major legal breakthrough came around 450 BC with the 12 tables. 12 tables covered property, contracts, marriage, crime, you name it. The Romans introduced groundbreaking concepts we now take for granted: presumption of innocence, the right to legal defense, proportional punishment. The idea that evidence matters more than accusations. They developed contract law that allowed businesses to make agreements enforceable anywhere in the empire. And they got property rights right too. Roman courts followed clear procedures: gather evidence, hear witnesses, deliberate, and rule. And if you thought the verdict was unfair, guess what? The legal system was just one part of what made Roman civilization so remarkably stable for so long. But it wasn't only about order and rules, it was about building a life that worked at every level. It meant feeding them, keeping them healthy, and making sure they could march thousands of miles without collapsing. So, the Romans figured out how to turn soldiers into self-sufficient survival machines. And maybe nowhere is that more obvious than in how the Romans handled the needs of their military. It's in long-lasting meals designed for soldiers on the move. It lasts forever. Dried meats and cheese grain, which they'd cook into porridge or bake as bread. It was basically the original energy bar, except way chewier and probably tasted like ancient cardboard, but it worked. They also built pop-up baking stations with ovens made from local stone or clay. These weren't armies, they were traveling kitchens, because running an empire meant more than just having strong soldiers. So yes, the Roman military ate better, drank smarter, and functioned like a logistical dream, centuries ahead of their time. And the Romans knew that control meant more than marching orders. It meant information fast, reliable, and secure. We've covered how it worked, but the impact. That kind of real-time governance changed everything. Governors could receive new laws. Armies could coordinate. Infrastructure projects could be planned and tracked. It was the ancient version of email. With more horses and less spam, massive. They were basically the original prepper community. But with shields, instead of YouTube tutorials, their innovations weren't flashy, they were effective. Their structures weren't just strong, they were resilient. Their systems weren't just clever, they were sustainable. Let's talk about Roman field rations. These weren't sloppy mess kits, they were carefully thought out, balanced. It was cheap, hydrating, mildly antibacterial. And loaded with vitamin C. Pasta helped prevent scurvy and made even the sketchiest water drinkable. They built ecosystems, interconnected systems of roads. Food, water, communication, laws, and heating that supported millions of people for hundreds of years. Each soldier carried a basic pack of essentials, hardtack biscuits. Impossibly hard, this combo gave a soldier around 3,000 calories a day. But they didn't just eat what they carried. Roman legions brought portable hand mills to grind grain into flour on site. Cooking was standardized. Soldiers were taught how to prepare specific dishes to guarantee nutrition and consistency. If they were in Gaul or in the Middle East, they could adapt their ingredients, but the base recipes stayed the same. Turning up your thermostat or drinking clean water from a tap, just remember, some ancient Roman figured out a version of that over 2,000 years ago. The result, Roman armies could feed themselves for months with little to no supply line. And for hydration, they had pasta, a drink made from water, vinegar, and sometimes honey. Think of it as the Roman answer to sports drinks, minus the bright colors and branding deals. But feeding armies and building roads wasn't enough. You had to keep the entire empire in sync. Which is why their communication system, the cursus publicus, was such a big deal. Maybe that's the most incredible hack of all. Thanks to this system, a command from the emperor in Rome could reach the edge of the empire in days or weeks, not months. In short, the Romans didn't just invent things. Their genius wasn't just in doing things first, it was in doing them right. Even now. You can see traces of Roman influence in almost everything we take for granted. Legal systems, water infrastructure, urban planning, food preservation, road engineering, mail delivery, building materials. So next time you're walking on a smooth road, they didn't just leave behind ruins, left behind blueprints for how to build a civilization that lasts.